Hello, everybody. Welcome. How are you all? Good. Happy Thursday. Glad you guys are here. You're making an excellent choice on a Thursday night for translation, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome to the Poetry Center. My name's Tyler. I work here as the director at the Poetry Center. You are here. How many of you have been to other readings this spring at the Poetry Center? Good work. Okay, excellent. If you haven't, it's okay. But there'll be more chances for you, but not this season. This is our last visit from a visiting writer in the spring. So a round of applause for a lot of good things that have happened this spring at the Poetry Center. This, of course, is a team effort, and a lot of people work on it. And so I will ask you to applaud again for Bruno Ingram, who does all the work to make the readings sound good and look good and record well. And we're really grateful for it. Bruno, thank you for all that you do. It's a great gift. We love working with you. And then likewise, one more big round of applause for my colleague, Paula Valenzuela, who's right here. Will you wave? Paula is amazing. And the visits that happen at the Poetry Center are largely possible because Paula has done a ton of work making sure writers get here safely, that they have a good time while they're here, that they get home safely, among many other things that Paula does. So it's a great gift to work with Paula every day. And it's a joy, and looking forward to all that comes up ahead. This reading tonight is a collaboration with the Creative Writing Program at the University of Arizona, and we're really pleased to be in partnership with them in all the ways that we are, and for their support of what happens at the Poetry Center. And we'll hear from my colleague Manuel Munoz in a little bit more about that. We also want to thank the Borchard Center on the Literary Arts for their support of this reading, and for all that they do for the literary arts in general, which is a great gift as well. So just a couple of things to tell you about. Again, this is our last visit from a visiting writer, but it is not the last thing that's happening at the Poetry Center this season. So on Saturday, the 3rd, this Saturday, there's a reading here at the Poetry Center at noon, and that's from our Classes and Workshops program. And those are for people that have participated in that program and the faculty that have taught in that program. And you can hear from students, and they'll read from their work. That's back here at noon on Saturday, the 3rd. On the 10th, a week later on Saturday, we'll be back here again for the graduation reading for the MFA program. And so this is a chance to hear from the writers that we'll be hearing from in the next decades. And you can hear them here first. So they'll be reading from their theses. You can help celebrate them and the work that they've done in the program here. That's May 10th at noon back here at the Poetry Center, and everyone is welcome. And then the last event of the season before a little bit of time will be closed, that I'll talk about in a moment, is on May 17th, and that's our annual anthology launch for the citywide youth anthologies that our K-12 programs create. If you've ever seen these, they're amazing. It's a beautiful book where each student who participates in those programs gets to publish one poem in an anthology. We have a book launch here at the center. They come up here and read from their work, just like all the other poets who come through town. And it's been a great gift to have that program happen. This year we were in 33 different classrooms, and each of those classrooms had a chance to have a visiting teaching artist for 8 weeks. And each of the students then gets to choose the work that will be in the book. So if you're interested in that kind of thing or want to have a delightful experience in general in the middle of May, come back. That's at 9 o'clock on the 17th back here at the Poetry Center. Immediately after that, we're going to be closed for a little while. And if you haven't heard this message yet, we're excited about this project. To my right, outside of the Poetry Center, there is a very ugly alley that is going away and is going to be replaced with a park-like space and a whole new outdoors area. And so that will begin on May 20th, and that work will proceed throughout the summer. The Poetry Center will be closed for the end of May, all of June, and the beginning of July. We're going to reopen to the public on July 8th. Construction will keep happening, but it will be the quieter parts of construction. So while it's loudest and dustiest, we're going to take a break and then come back in the summer. We're looking forward to seeing you then. And then looking forward to welcoming everyone back in the fall to a really beautiful new space that'll open up a lot of new possibilities for how work happens here at the Poetry Center. So that is a quick list of everything that's coming up. There's some great summer programs that are happening. Our calendar is going to be coming to your mailboxes very soon. That information is going to be on our website and in our newsletter soon as well. And hope you'll take advantage of some of those programs too. To help welcome Natasha Wimmer, who we're so happy is here visiting us in Tucson, an amazing translator who does an incredible work. I want to welcome up my colleague Manuel Munoz to introduce Natasha. Manuel has helped organize this event. He's the author of the novel What You See in the Dark and the story collections Zigzagger and The Faith Healer of Olive Avenue. And these three earlier works are being reprinted by Triquarterly Books, which is an imprint of Northwestern University Press, which is awesome and deserves its own round of applause. His most recent collection of stories is called The Consequences, and it is an amazing book. Please help me welcome my colleague, Manuel Munoz.
Thank you, Tyler, so much. Superstar evening for a superstar. Thank you, Natasha. I have to bring this. This is on my bookshelf. The book that was, in that moment. And to think that I get a chance to say a few words about the translator. But we're going to close out the Distinguished Visitor series. It's commencement time, and it's always a time of celebration. In doing so, I want to acknowledge that there is some continued good news for our creative writing program. There are a lot of first books that are coming. There are some stories that are being accepted and published, and the theses are being completed as we speak. But there are some major recognitions that I would like to mention. Faculty member Bojan Lewis. Bojan, I saw him here. And MFA alum Raquel Gutierrez. Raquel is here as well. We're both named recipients of the United States Artist Fellowships earlier this spring. And just a few weeks ago, MFA alum Isha Sabatini-Sloan was awarded a Whiting Writers Award. So there's a number of good things that have been coming out for creative writing. And I give you that good news because it's been mostly bad news, to be honest. The Distinguished Visitor series was very fortunate this academic year to bookend the semester with literary offerings because of the collaborations with the Poetry Center, and notably the Borchard Center on Literary Arts. Our funding was extremely limited this academic year, but thanks to the Borchard Center and their mission to, quote, create a community of literary artists from across the Americas to foster meaningful connections between people, culture, and the natural world, we were able to host the writer Brenda Lozano last August, and tonight, Natasha Wimmer. Now more than ever, fostering meaningful connections is crucial to breaking past the cruelty behind those forces trying to sever those connections. To find common purpose and human connection, it is necessary to hear how others render their hard times, or how others use art not as a receptacle for false hope, but action and power. History happens to all of us, is written by all of us worldwide, but we are limited by our language, and we count on the translators to help untangle the knots of our limited knowledge. They straighten us out, speak to a multitude of struggles, illuminate multiple pasts. They are, I think, our greatest literary practitioners. Wimmer herself says that she is not a writer, but is careful to illuminate the particular task of the translator. She's very much a carrier of wisdom, as are all translators, blessed with the ability to speak the intricate cadences of experience we also desperately need to hear and learn from. We welcome Natasha from the East Coast, where she teaches at both Princeton and Columbia. She is renowned as a translator of books by Roberto Bolaño, Mario Vargas Llosa, and most recently Nona Fernández and Álvaro Enrigue, whose novel You Dreamed of Empires is over on that table, translated by Natasha, was named one of the 10 best books of 2024 by the New York Times. So I ask you to give a Tucson bienvenida to Natasha Wimmer.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. And thank you also especially to Tyler and Paola at the Poetry Center, and to Michael Spurgeon of the Borchard Foundation, who has been so generous. And a special shout out to Allison Hawthorne Deming, who has just made my trip super special. So it's been a treat to see her and to get to know everybody here. I've never been to Tucson before. It's a fabulous city. You're all very lucky. So thank you for welcoming me. I originally intended to read just from my most recently published translation, the novel You Dreamed of Empires by the Mexican writer Álvaro Enrigue. But as I thought it over, I realized that this was an excellent opportunity to read a sampling of work. One of the best things about being a translator is that you get to inhabit a whole host of writers with different styles and perspectives and quirks. The translator can be a kind of chameleon, diving into new seas of language and adapting to new backgrounds with each project. There's always some research involved. That's one of my favorite parts of being a translator. And for a fleeting moment, I can trick myself into thinking I'm an expert on the subject of the novel or the book at hand. Most recently, for example, I've been working on a couple of collections of poems by the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton. And I've immersed myself in the debates of communist intellectuals about the role of poetry in a revolutionary society, particularly in Cuba in the early 1970s, when Dalton was living there and participating in those debates. Today I'll be reading a few of the Dalton poems, which have not been published. I'm still working on those, as well as a selection from You Dreamed of Empires. And then, in a bit of a throwback, I'll read a section from The Savage Detectives, which is the first Bolaño novel I translated 20 years ago at this point, and which was such an important book for me, and I know also for many readers. I'll begin with the Dalton poems. It's especially wonderful to be here at the Poetry Center for this, because Dalton is my first foray into poetry as a translator, and it's been a really illuminating experience. One of the truisms of translation is that the translator isn't allowed to skip. So, in other words, as readers, we sometimes let ourselves glide past phrases we don't understand, trusting that we'll get the gist of the passage anyway. The translator cannot do that. We have to wrestle with every opaque construction and wayward word until we think we've understood it, and then we have to triangulate between that understanding and the surface obscurity to find the right balance for the reader. We don't want to spell things out too obviously or artlessly, but at the same time, we want to let a glimmer of critical understanding light the way for the reader. In poetry, as you can imagine, this kind of negotiation happens constantly and is more fraught. As a translator of prose, I sit there typing away. And as a translator of poetry, I'm much more likely to be staring into space. So the Dalton poems vary a lot. Some of them are relatively transparent, and those are, for the most part, those are the ones I've chosen to read tonight. Others are truly opaque. So for the first time as a translator, I've been faced with the question, what do you do when you simply don't understand a line or a whole poem? I'm firmly of the belief that anything worth reading has some through line or some subterranean coherence or unifying element. So the task of the translator in that case becomes teasing that out as best I can, even if it's tenuous or rooted more in cadence and sound than in sense. But occasionally I succumb to the reasoning of St. Jerome, who said about translating scripture that he always translated sense for sense, except where the mysteries of the sacred were concerned. And there he translated verbum per verbum, or word for word. I don't think there are too many mysteries of the sacred in the poems I'm reading today, but you can see what you think. So the collection that these poems come from, 3 of the poems come from, is called A Slightly Odious Book. And as you can tell from the title, it tends toward the irreverent. Many of the poems are about poets themselves, whom Dalton likes to mock. And as I mentioned before, in the early 1970s, as he was writing these poems, Dalton was living in Cuba and taking part in heated debates about the role of the poet in revolutionary society, somewhat pertinent for us today. On the one hand, he felt that poets were irrelevant unless they fully engaged in the revolutionary struggle. He himself trained as a guerrilla fighter and was killed at the age of 40 by his own comrades in El Salvador in an incident that has never been fully explained. But on the other hand, he resisted the growing tendency of the Cuban government toward the imposition on poets and writers of a Soviet-style social realism. Avant-garde poetry, as he saw it, was as important as armed struggle, and in fact was its own kind of utopian endeavor. So first I'll read two poems that paint satirical portraits, one of a poet and the other of a young revolutionary, and then I'll read a poem that presents a relatively idealistic view of poetry. And then at the last minute, I added on a prose poem from another collection, Taberna, which I'm also working on, because I decided that these three poems that I had chosen were actually too transparent, and I wanted to give you a little taste of the more, really what is a more difficult one. So they're short though, don't worry. And one of them I will also read in Spanish, just to give you a little taste of the Spanish. So the first one is the portrait of a young revolutionary, and it's called Portrait of a Disciple. Between the top of his ear and an overgrown mop of hair, the feather of a peach-fed hawk. Between his teeth, a Havana cigar bought at Fernando Pessoa's tobacco shop. Below, wedged into his wise armpit, Schopenhauer and the military writings of Mao Zedong. In place of chest and abdomen, an ancient Venetian mirror, scented with bee larvae and parsley. Between his legs, the bell of a loudspeaker and a Flemish pike. Hooves soldered to some strange skates driven by tiny motors from a model plane kit. So that's the disciple. And now we have the poet. And this poem is called, As a Poet, I Respect Him Greatly, Dear Madam, but, ... And it goes, don't be fooled by his loot. The man drinks and pisses like a cupboard. Consider his calling card an asp. Don't accept his flowers. He probably coughed them up while he was ringing the bell. Send the little girls to their rooms, the big girls in the silver spoons. Most of all, never listen to his poems. He doles them out the way King Farouk gives tips. The only place he'd look honest is on the gallows, or in a Bavarian urinal, or a whorehouse in Buenaventura. So that's a little taste of what poets have in store for them in this collection. All right, and here's a more serious one about poetry, and this one I'll read first in Spanish. It's called Ars Poética 1970. Las letras de un poema no son las piececillas de una máquina, el mapa perfecto para explicar la teoría molecular. Las letras de un poema son los días en que no tuve tus noticias, la foto de la muchacha asesinada, tan parecida a ti, la absurda muerte de Alfredo, las arenas que se nos metieron en los ojos, las promesas hechas mientras el bus corría entre Orly e Inválidos. Luego viene algo como el olvido, un olvido organizador. Por eso es que los poetas se persignan entre carcajadas ante la teoría del conocimiento. And so here it is in English. Ars Poetica, 1970. The letters of a poem aren't little machine bits, some perfect map of molecular theory. The letters of a poem are the days I had no news, the photograph of the girl who was shot, who looked so much like you, Alfredo's absurd death, the sands that got in our eyes, the promises made as the bus shuttled between Orly and Invalides. Then comes something like forgetting, a forgetting that makes things fall into place, which is why poets cross themselves and laugh at the idea of a theory of knowledge. And then here's the prose poem from Taberna. It's called Oppression and Milk, Anticlimax. I refuse to believe in poisons. Since the Spanish conquest, my nation has been laughing maniacally through a gaping wound. It's almost always night, so no one can see the bleeding. Oh, my brothers, scratchers of your own ribs, like skinny winged piglets that grow restless because the daisy dealer is late. Oh, tiny fringe of a humanity, long-termed fractious, which I nevertheless saw coming like a mountain of water, alive and dead at every instant, all power. Only the fact of my belonging unified your two-faced soul. O beloved monsters, lighthouses of the most manic firmament, matchstick nail scratches in the air. See how there is suddenly room for you alongside my old and contemptible peace, the doddering housekeeper who from this day on I feel obliged to kick to the curb. Forgive me. The poisons, they say, come in many colors and can be as green as a red apple. This proves their complete inhumanity and alienates us so thoroughly that it's better to fall back on history rather than bleed ourselves dry on the salt of remedies. Who among you had a father? We know that nothing remains pure but poetry, the blind madness of silver flowers, cylindrical smoke, the fresh rot of infinite vantages. One long ago afternoon, when my father brought me a glass of milk and told me I should convince Mama to see reason, I was examining a photograph on the cover of Life magazine, which back then didn't come in color or in Spanish, of Winston Churchill looking like our Catholic Pope and blessing the world with smoky words of warrior wisdom. El Salvador is a country where the basilisks are friendly cave dwellers, their eyes mostly closed for our own good. Meanwhile, our hens are fierce. The hateful glare of all the world's hens is borne out by their actions, and their brand of arrogance erupts into catastrophic crime. I drink the glass of milk cross-eyed, thinking about a Humphrey Bogart movie where there is more than one poisoning, and everyone in the audience quakes. My father could have beaten Humphrey Bogart in any fight. One hand tied behind his back, eyes blindfolded, legs in a sack. It was the best glass of milk I've had in my life, which must also be why I love you, country of mine, history, perils, etc. So there's that one. So to completely change gears now, here is a passage from You Dreamed of Empires by Álvaro Enrigue. So let's see how my time is going. So Álvaro is, as I said, a Mexican novelist who many of you may have come across. He has been all over the place this year, who's written a series of brilliant hybrid historical novels that bring the past vividly to life, but also weave it with the present in startling and subversive ways. This is maybe especially true of You Dreamed of Empires, which is set in Tenochtitlan over the course of a single day, during the month that Hernán Cortés and his band of conquistadors spend as guests/prisoners of Moctezuma, the head of the Mexica Empire. As gradually becomes clear in the course of the novel, the entire Mexica population is always slightly high on magic mushrooms. This apparently has some basis in fact. It appears there were also magic tomatoes. I wouldn't say that Dalton and Álvaro have a huge amount in common, but they do have a similar satirical sensibility. Álvaro lives in New York City, as do I, so we've been able to work closely together on the translations of his novels. Unlike many writers, he relishes the process of translation, or at least he does a good job of pretending that he does. And he often writes new passages for the English versions of his books, which is, at the time I'm, a little miffed, but then I'm excited. So two of the protagonists of You Dreamed of Empires are actually translators themselves, or more accurately, interpreters. Malinali, also otherwise known as La Malinche, the famed and sometimes reviled translator and companion of Cortés, and a priest called Aguilar. Malinali translates from Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, to Maya, and Aguilar, who learned Maya as a prisoner in the Yucatan, translates from Maya to Spanish. So this is just from the very beginning of Empires. I'll just read the first chapter. Captain, Jazmín Caldera, native of Zarzales, Extremadura, couldn't eat the turkey broth with flowers, though it looked exquisite and he was starving. He had been assigned a place at the table between the priests of Xipe and Tezcatlipoca. Draped like a cape around the shoulders of the former was the decaying, blackened skin of a warrior sacrificed who knows when, while the latter's matted locks, neither cut nor washed since he'd taken orders at the temple, were crusted with many moons of sacrificial blood. Quail daily, sometimes turtle or wolf, but on major festival days, of which there was one each month, warrior blood, preferably Tlaxcalteca. Jazmín Caldera reached out his hand for the fine lacquered cup, into which a woman had poured chocolate frothed in water with honey, chili, and vanilla, and breathed in the scent as deeply as he could, trying to ignore the wolfish aroma exuded by his dining companions. He looked up toward the head of the table. The captain general of the expedition was watching him fixedly, those icy eyes ordering Jazmín to be quiet and eat his soup once and for all. Caldera turned his gaze to the left. The priest of Xipe was painted from head to toe with black and blue stripes. Under the human skin he wore as a cape, he had on a white robe patterned with shoots of corn in a featherwork design. 2 enormous jade discs hung from his ears, set around the edges with gold and silver snakes. They must have been hideously heavy, surely painful. Under his lip was a gold labret, a little dog's head. It slipped in and out of sight each time he took a swallow of soup or chocolate, as if playing in a little skin house. The priest of Tezcatlipoca was dressed less luxuriously in a plain red robe. His body, or what could be seen of it, was painted black, except for the part of his face between nose and chin, which was also red. The ribbon that tied up the towering, malodorous thatch on top of his head could have graced the swan-like neck of the daughter of a Spanish grandee. Freshwater pearls, little jade heads, and coral animals chasing each other along a trail of silver thread. His teeth were filed, sharp as a cat's. Jazmín returned his attention to his plate, to his cup of chocolate, and then again to the captain, with his unrelenting stare, seated at the head of the table, elbow to elbow with Princess Atatoshli. Now the captain raised his eyebrows to punctuate the urgency of his command. Eat. Caldera lifted the cup of chocolate and took a long swallow. Though the drink was possibly his favorite of all the many extraordinary new things he had tried since they had landed, it nearly came back up. It was impossible to disassociate it from his table mates' reek of coagulated blood. Even so, the immediate thrill of the cacao to which the new arrivals were as yet unaccustomed, a tickle at the base of the neck, a shudder of the spine, the tremendous urge to do something, anything, made him suspect that he could handle the soup despite the stench. He picked up the dish, and as he raised it to his mouth, he felt spasms again. He set it down. Now the princess was watching him curiously too. Jazmín raised his eyes, looking everywhere but toward the priests and the captain general. He gazed directly across the table, past the heads of Aguilar and Malinali, people he assumed were used to eating even human flesh. He looked at the wall and thought about the city of Selenites swelling on the other side. He returned in his imagination to its temples, canals, and floating neighborhoods, ringed by giant rectangular rafts, each identical to the next in shape and size, where the Mexica grew their vegetables and flowers. In his mind's eye, he saw the lake that surrounded the city, preventing the Spaniards from escape if the emperor gave the order to loose his eagle warriors. He envisioned the volcanoes that had been such torture to cross, standing sentry over the Anahuac Valley, scattered with white cities and fortified with towers and temples. Again, he saw Amecameca, the start of the Iztapalapa causeway across the lake, the flower arch, mythical Moctezuma and his retinue, and the moment when the idiot captain general almost sank everything by trying to hug him. They had entered the city. The mayor had lodged them in Axayacatl's palace, so lovely and serene, and they'd been invited to eat right here in the Hall of Emperors Past with the princess's entourage. They had come to the very heart of the great invincible city of Mexico Tenochtitlan, and their task was almost complete. Everything was a little hazy, muddled, all of it in honor perhaps undeserved. They had made it here with staggering effort and lunatic determination, and they had proved themselves to be good soldiers, going on when no one else would have, always betting against the odds. It meant something. But that had been the road, the hustle, a game, played to the death, but a game in the end. Now that they were in the palace and in the presence of the princess, it seemed to Jasmine that the ship might start to take on water anywhere. The captain general, sitting amid such grandeur, such Saturnalian figures, suddenly looked like what he'd been back in Cuba, an ill-favored and artless son of Extremadura. They were provincials, nobodies, hicks. One blunder could reveal that they were really a bunch of loudmouth bastards who claimed to have come in the name of an emperor they never had a hope of meeting, when in truth they didn't even represent the adelantado of Cuba, to whom they'd given the slip in order to do what they were doing. Jasmine sighed. He returned his gaze to the table, but couldn't bring himself to take his plate in his hands. In the calmest of voices, friendly, as if he were commenting on the pleasing warmth of the Anahuac sun, he said that they would have to forgive him, but nobody could eat like this. The captain general smiled slightly, tilting his head. He moved his jaw back and forth a few times. Each time he jutted out his chin, his eyes narrowed a little, a ghastly sight. Jasmine nodded his own head discreetly, as if pleading for his superior's patience. But really, he only wanted the man to stop making that nightmarish face. He picked up the soup plate again in both hands, breathing deeply to lock in its scent. And again, the smell of dried blood and decaying skin got in the way. Lowering the plate, he set his palms on the linen tablecloth and closed his eyes. He kept his composure. Controlling his nausea and tone of voice, he glanced right and left at the priests. "I mean, what is this?" he asked. And he smiled at the captain general as if begging for pity. Cortés took a generous swallow of soup and bellowed his delight. He smiled at Princess Atotoshli sitting next to him, with a pleasant expression still on his face, but his fists clenched on the linen cloth, his knuckles white with rage at Caldera's insubordination. He said quietly, almost in a sing-song, "Shut up and eat the soup, son of a bitch. We are the Empress's guests." Caldera smiled. "I can't," he replied. "If only you knew what they smelled like, Hernan. This one here must have eaten mashed-up babies for breakfast." The captain general returned his smile, and as if commenting on the sweetness of the chocolate, said, "You think you smell of roses? Shut up and eat, then vomit later all you want." Malinali, the Nahua translator, raised her eyes from her plate. In Maya, she asked Aguilar, the Spanish translator, whether they should translate what Caldera and Cortés were saying for the benefit of the princess and the nobles and the priests crowded around the table. He whispered in her ear, also in Maya, that he didn't think so. It was just conquistador chatter. Malinali spoke Nahuatl and Maya, but not Spanish, and Aguilar spoke Maya and Castilian, but not Nahuatl. The conversations between the Colwa and the people she and everybody else called the Castilteca still had to pass through a double filter. Now she felt the punch of Princess Atotoshli's gaze. The princess was the emperor's sister, but also his wife, waiting for her to translate what had been said. She lifted her face, smiled, and said in Nahuatl, "They are saying how delicious everything is." The princess twitched her mouth as if to suggest she did not believe a word of it. The translator shrugged. In a bid for patience, she said, "They are savages, of course. They like the taste of the juice of rotting fruit they bring from their own lands, so they can't believe there is such a thing as chocolate." The priest of Xipe, who had just annihilated his soup, burped modestly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing his makeup a little. He said in Nahuatl, as if talking to himself, "They're imbeciles and they smell like dogs and caca. I say we sacrifice them now before we get used to them." The princess gave him a reproving look. "We'll do what my brother tells us to do," she said firmly. Aguilar cleared his throat to get Malinali's attention. He asked her in Maya what they were saying. She replied, "The priest is asking the princess whether she likes Hernando's looks. She says she finds him handsome, but such things are hardly fit conversation for a queen." Aguilar raised his cup of chocolate. With a glance at his comrades, he said, "Looking good, Spain." He turned his gaze to Jasmine, over whom he had particular sway, and said, "And you, eat the fucking soup. because they won't serve the next course until you finish and we're all hungry. Caldera considered how hard they'd fought to get where they were, and he managed to put things in perspective. He finished the soup in a single gulp. Salud, said the Captain General, raising his own glass. So, there we go. Thank you. The next one is funny, too. So finally, a section from The Savage Detectives. I was a relatively green translator when I tackled this book, having previously translated some volumes of nonfiction by Mario Vargas Llosa and a few other assorted novels. It was by far the most difficult thing I had ever done. And I knew how important it was to get it right. I had read it on submission for the publisher and written a report for the publisher. And the deeper in I got, the more amazed I was that it hadn't been translated already. At that point, it had been out in Spanish for maybe 5 years. I loved it, and it is probably still my favorite of Bolaño's novels, although there's a lot of competition. As you probably know, it begins in Mexico City with the story of two young poets, Arturo Belano and Ulises Lima, and their search for Cesaria Tinajero, an avant-garde poet of the previous generation. But there's much more to it than that. The bulk of the novel, the long middle section, is told from the perspectives of some 40-some characters who cross paths with either Belano or Ulises all over the world. And like Dalton, who is the author of a single novel called Pobrecito Poeta que era yo, which is not translated yet and very hard to get hold of even in Spanish, and probably inspired the Savage Detectives. Bolaño claimed to have met Dalton in El Salvador, so there is a connection there between the two writers. Both, and also the other connection, which you'll see here, is that Bolaño writes scathingly and lovingly about poets and poetry and the pursuit of literature in general. So you'll recognize the tone. The section that I'm going to read is from the big middle, the long middle part. And this is in the voice of Luis Sebastián Rosado, who is a snotty upper crust young poet who, despite himself, is attracted to the more streetwise group of poets around Arturo Belano and Ulises Lima. And so Bolaño and Lima's group call themselves the Visceral Realists. And this section that I've chosen to read here gets deep into the weeds of Mexican and French poetry, so it's perfect for a Center of Poetry reading. And for all you sophisticated readers out there, I'm sure you'll get all the references. It's also touching and hilarious, I think, and I hope that comes across. It also has a long French poem in the middle of it. I will read part of the French poem, but I will not subject you to my French pronunciation for the entire thing. So this is Luis Sebastián Rosado, La Rama Dorada Coffee Shop, Colonia Coyoacán, Mexico City, DF, April 1976. Monsiváis said it first. Disciples of Marinetti and Zara, their noisy, outrageous, overwrought poems did battle in the realm of simple typographic arrangement, never rising above the level of childish entertainment. Monsi was talking about the stridentist, but the same goes for the visceral realists. No one paid attention to them, and they opted for indiscriminate assault. In December of '75, just before Christmas, I was unlucky enough to run into some of them here at La Rama Dorada. The owner, Don Nestor Pesqueira, will back me up. It was extremely unpleasant. One of them, the one in charge, was Ulises Lima. The second was a big, fat, dark guy called Moctezuma or Cuauhtemoc. The third went by the name Luscious Skin. I was sitting right here, waiting for Alberto Moore and his sister, and all of a sudden these three nuts surround me, sitting down one on each side of me, and they say, Luisito, let's talk poetry. Let's analyze the future of Mexican poetry. Something like that. I'm not a violent person, and of course I got nervous. I thought, what are they doing here? How did they find me? What scores have they come to settle? This country is a disgrace, it must be said, and so is Mexican literature. It must also be said. Anyway, we were talking for 20 minutes. I've never been so annoyed by the lateness of Albertito and his snotty sister. And finally, we even managed to agree on several points. When it came down to it, 90% of the time, we hated the same things. Of course, I always stood up for what Octavio Paz was doing on the literary scene. And of course, all they seemed to like was what they were doing themselves. Thank goodness. That being a lesser evil, I mean, since it would have been worse if they'd declared themselves disciples of the peasant poets, or followers of poor Rosario Castellanos, or disciples of Jaime Sabines. One Jaime is enough, in my opinion. And then Alberto got here, and I was still alive. There'd been a little bit of shouting, some unpleasant language, a certain kind of behavior that was inappropriate in a place like La Rama Dorada. Don Nestor Pesquera will back me up here, but that was all. And when Alberto arrived, I thought I'd handled the situation well. But then Julia Moore comes right out and asks them who they are and what they plan to do that night. And the one called Luscious Skin is quick to say that they're not doing anything, that if she has any ideas, she should say so. He's up for anything. And then Julita, oblivious of the looks her brother and I are shooting her, says we could go dancing at Priapos, an insanely vulgar place in Colonia 10 de Mayo or Tepito. I've only been there once, and I've always done my best to forget it. And since neither Alberto nor I can say no to Julita, off we go in Alberto's car, with Alberto, Ulises Lima, and me in the front seat, and Julita, Luscious Skin, and the guy called Cuauhtemoc or Moctezuma in the back seat. Honestly, I feared the worst. These people weren't trustworthy. Somebody told me once that they cornered Monsi and Sanborns at the Casa Borda. But since Monsi did agree to have coffee with them, granted them an audience, you might say, it was partly his fault, because everybody knows the visceral realists are just like the stridentists. And everybody knows what Monsi thinks about the stridentists. So he really couldn't complain about what happened. And anyway, nobody or almost nobody knows what did happen, though occasionally I've been tempted to ask him, but I haven't, not wanting to pry or open old wounds. Still, something happened to him during his meeting with the visceral realists, and everybody knows it. Everybody who secretly loves or hates Monsi, and there were all kinds of hypotheses and theories. But anyway, that's what I was wondering, as Alberto's car shot like lightning or crawled like a cockroach, depending on the traffic, toward Priapos. And in the back seat, Julita Moore kept talking and talking and talking to the two visceral realist bums. I'll spare you a description of the club itself. I swear to God, I thought we wouldn't get out of there alive. All I'll say is that the furnishings and human specimens adorning its interior seemed arbitrarily plucked from Lizardi's The Mangy Parrot, Mariano Azuela's The Underdogs, Del Paso's José Trigo, the worst novels of the Onda, and the worst 50s porn. More than one woman looked like Tongolele, who incidentally, I don't think was making movies in the 50s, but should have been. So, as I was saying, we went into Priapos and sat at a table close to the dance floor, and as Julita danced a cha-cha or a bolero or a danzón, I'm not exactly up on the annals of popular music, Alberto and I started to talk about something, what it was, I swear I can't remember, and a waiter brought us a bottle of tequila or rat poison that we accepted without a murmur. That's how desperate we were. And suddenly, in less time than it takes to say otherness, we were drunk. And Ulises Lima was reciting a poem in French. What in the world for? I don't know. But he was reciting it. I didn't realize he spoke French. English, maybe. I think I'd seen a translation of his somewhere of Richard Brautigan, terrible poet, or John Giorno, whoever he is, maybe a stand-in for Lima himself. But French? That surprised me a little. Good enunciation, passable pronunciation, and the poem, how to put it, sounded familiar, very familiar, but because of my increasing drunkenness or the relentless boleros, I couldn't identify it. I thought of Claudel, but none of us can imagine Lima reciting Claudel, can we? I thought of Baudelaire, I thought of Catulle Mendes, some of whose texts I translated for a university journal. I thought of Nerval. Ashamed as I am to admit it, those were the names that came to mind. In my defense, I should say that soon, through the haze of alcohol, I asked myself what Nerval could possibly have in common with Mendes. And then I thought of Mallarmé. Alberto, who must have been playing the same game, said Baudelaire. It wasn't Baudelaire, of course. Here's the poem. Let's see if you can guess. Maybe I'll let you all guess that before we get to there. So this is just the first stanza. There are 3 stanzas. Mon triste cœur bave à la poupe. mon cœur couvert de caporal. Ils y lancent des jets de soupe, mon triste cœur bave à la poupe. Sur les colibettes de la troupe, qui pousse un rire général, mon triste cœur bave à la poupe, mon cœur couvert de caporal. Anybody? Yes. Who said Rimbaud? Very nice. It's Rimbaud, which was a surprise. Relatively speaking, that is. The really surprising thing was that he recited it in French. Anyway, I was a little angry not to have guessed it, since I know Rimbaud's work fairly well, but I didn't let it bother me. Another point in common. Maybe we would make it out of that hellhole alive. And after reciting Rimbaud, Ulises Lima told a story about Rimbaud and some war. Which war, I don't know, war not being a subject that interests me. But there was something, a common theme linking Rimbaud, the poem, and the war, a sordid story, I'm sure, although at the time my ears and then my eyes were registering other sordid little stories. I swear I'll kill Julita Moore if she drags me to another dive like Priapos. Disjointed scenes in which brooding young delinquents danced with desperate young cleaning girls or desperate young whores in a whirl of contrast that I confess heightened my drunkenness if such a thing is possible. Then there was a fight somewhere. I didn't see anything. I just heard shouts. A pair of thugs emerged from the shadows, dragging a guy with blood all over his face. I remember I told Alberto that we should go, that things could take a turn for the worse. But Alberto was listening to Ulises Lima's story, and he ignored me. I remember that I watched Julita dancing with one of Ulises' friends. Then I remember dancing a bolero myself with luscious skin, as if it were a dream. But still, it might have been the first time I'd felt good all night. In fact, it was definitely the first time I'd felt good all night. In fact, next, like someone waking up, I remember whispering into my dance partner's ear that what we were doing would probably offend the other dancers and spectators. It's not clear what happened next. Someone said something rude to me. I was, I don't know, ready to crawl under a table and fall asleep, or curl up on Luscious Skin's chest and fall asleep there, too. But someone said something rude to me, and Luscious Skin made a motion as if to leave me and turned to face the person who'd spoken. I don't know what he said, pansy or faggot. I'm still not accustomed to that sort of language, though I know I should be. But I was so drunk, my muscles were slack, and he couldn't let go of me. If he had, I would have fallen. And he just shot something back from the middle of the dance floor. I closed my eyes, trying to remove myself from the situation. Luscious Skin's shoulder smelled like sweat, a strange acidic smell, as if he just walked away unscathed from the explosion of a chemical plant. And then I heard him speak, not to one person, but to several people, more than two at least, and people were raising their voices. Then I opened my eyes, my God, and what I saw wasn't the people surrounding us, but myself, my arm on Luscious Skin's shoulder, my left arm around his waist, my cheek on his shoulder. And I saw, or imagined I saw, the malicious looks, the stares of born killers. And then, rising in sheer terror above my drunkenness, I wanted to disappear. Oh, earth, swallow me up. I begged to be struck by lightning. I wished, in a word, never to have been born. How completely mortifying. I was red with shame. I wanted to vomit. I had let go of Luscious Skin, and I was hardly able to stand, realizing that I was the object of cruel mockery and under attack at the same time. My one consolation was that the mocker was also under attack. It was essentially as if, having been betrayed in battle, what battles, what wars was Ulises Lima talking about? I was begging the angels of justice or the angels of the apocalypse for a great wave to appear, a great miraculous wave that would sweep both of us away, that would sweep us all away, that would put an end to the ridicule and injustice. But then, through the icy lakes of my eyes, the wrong metaphor since it was sweltering inside Priapos, but I can't think of any better way to say that I was about to cry, and that at the exact moment of about to had changed my mind, backpedaling, but that a distorting layer of liquid still glazed my pupils. I saw the mirific figure of Julita Moore appear intertwined with Cuauhtémoc or Moctezuma or Nezahualcóyotl or whatever his name was, and he and Luscious Skin stood up to the people who were making trouble, while Julita put her arm around my waist and asked me whether those sons of bitches had done anything to me, and got me off the dance floor and out of that revolting dive. Once we were outside, Julita led me to the car, and in the middle of the street, I started to cry, and when Julita helped me into the back seat, I asked, no, begged her to leave with me. I wanted the three of us to go and leave the others there with their own evil kind. Please, Julita, I said. And she said, for fuck's sake, Luisito, you're spoiling my night. Please don't start. And then I remember that I said or shouted or howled, what they've done to me is worse than what they did to Monsi. And Julita asked what the fuck they'd done to Monsi. She also asked which Monsi I meant. She said Montse or Monchi, I can't remember. And I said, Monsi Weiss, Julita, Monsi Weiss, the essayist. And she said, oh, not seeming surprised at all. My God, the fortitude of that woman, I thought. And then I think I vomited and I started to cry and then vomited in Alberto's car. And Julita started to laugh. And by then the others were coming out of Priapos. I saw their shadows on the beam of a streetlight. And I thought, what have I done? What have I done? And I was so ashamed that I collapsed on the seat and curled up in a ball and pretended to be asleep. But I could hear them talking. Julita said something, and the visceral realist replied. Their voices sounded cheerful, not hostile at all. Then Alberto got in the car and said, what the fuck is this? It stinks in here. And then I opened my eyes, and seeking his eyes in the rear view mirror, I said, I'm sorry, Alberto, I didn't mean to. I feel really sick. And then Julita got in the passenger seat and said, my God, Alberto, open the windows, it reeks. And I said, do you mind, Julita? There's no need to exaggerate. And Julita said, Luisito, it smells like you've been dead for a week. And I laughed, not much, but I was already starting to feel better. At the end of the street, under the lighted sign for Priapos, shadows were roving, but not toward our car. And then Julita Moore rolled down her window and kissed luscious skin and Moctezuma or Cuauhtemoc, but not Ulises Lima, who was standing away from the car looking up at the sky. And then luscious skin stuck his head in the window and said, how are you, Luis? And I don't think I even answered. I just made a gesture as if to say, fine, I'm fine. And then Alberto started the Dodge, and we headed out of Tepito with all the windows rolled down on our way back to our own neighborhoods. So if you want to find out what happens between Luis Rosado and Luscious Skin, you got to read the book. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really been a delight.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. One more big round of applause for Natasha Wimmer. There are books for sale over on the right, so I hope you'll come and buy some of those. I know Natasha would be happy to sign them. And then we hope to see you back here for upcoming programs at the Poetry Center. Thanks for coming tonight. We'll see you all soon. Take care.